Hello and welcome to the Reducing Paint Costs in Your Paint Department, Improving Paint and Material Gross Profits webinar for MSOs, sponsored by UniCure and PPG. I'm Krista McNamara, Managing Editor of ABRN Magazine, and I'll be your moderator today. We have with us Darrell Amberson, Director of MSO Relations with ABRN and VP of Operations with LaMettry's Collision, Geoff Laramy, Training and Development Manager with 3M, and Tom Brown, MSO Manager, also with 3M. Darrell, Geoff, and Tom will discuss profitability with regard to paint and materials in collision shops. There are so many variables that it can be a real challenge to get your arms around this very vital portion of your business. Waste and redos are a very big factor as well. So we're here today to help MSOs examine process changes and other waste reduction ideas that can boost the bottom line. Again, we'd like to thank our sponsors today, UniCure and PPG, for their support in bringing you this information. So Darrell, Geoff, and Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Krista. Today we'll be speaking about seeking paint department financial high performance, and we'll be speaking specifically on the issues of a solid business plan, strong sales, measuring costs, relating unnecessary costs as waste, and reducing waste. Go ahead, Krista, to the next slide, please.
Okay, so to give Darrell, Geoff, and Tom a little more information about our audience today, we invite you to indicate on the screen which area of the industry you're in. Are you an MSO, a single location shop, an insurance company, an OE manufacturer, a paint company, or other? Again, the options are MSO, single location shop, insurance company, OE manufacturer, paint company, or other. Okay, so today it looks like we have about 15% of the attendees are MSOs, about 32% are single location shops, about 24% are paint companies, and about 21% are other. Okay, so Darrell, Geoff, and Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the greatest form of waste?
Thank you, Krista. Of course, the obvious discussion when we start talking about reducing costs would be talking about how we can reduce the amount of paint we purchase, sandpapers, primers, sealers, all those sorts of things. And we will be getting into that and talk a lot about how we measure that and how we could look at reducing those costs. But before we do that, I want to get into a greater vision topic here and bring to the audience's attention that the greatest form of waste is taking your business in the wrong direction. I think it's critical, first of all, that you have a vision for your business and plan for it in today's marketplace, and that you're pushing it in the right direction. Because frankly, as we think about it, the greatest form of waste, again, is going the wrong way. We can pick up a few cents and dollars here and there and reducing some of these material costs, but that can frankly pale in comparison to taking your business the wrong way. I really like this diagram here that was provided by Dick Cross, who is a 8-time turnaround CEO of a number of businesses, including CarStar. And what Dick is saying in this diagram is that, first of all, you need to have a vision for your business, which leads to establishing a strategy and how you're going to accomplish your vision. Your vision can essentially be the goal, and then the strategy leads to a plan for how you're going to execute that. And keep in mind that in terms of the attributes that you will need to implement that will be leadership qualities to first establish the vision and strategy, and then we need management attributes to evolve strategy into a plan of execution. So again, before we get into all these details, please keep in mind that that is the greatest value for your business in terms of having a solid business plan and really know where you're taking your business in today's world. And that can be very relevant based upon how things are changing. Geoff, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, Darrell. It reminds me of a quote that I read recently by Peter Drucker, a renowned quality and efficiency expert, who made the comment, the greatest inefficiency is doing very efficiently that which we shouldn't be doing at all. And it gets at that whole idea of waste and maybe having the company in the right direction, focusing on the right things.
Excellent. Good point, Geoff. Thank you.
So let's dive into our topic matter at hand, paint material gross profit. It's a very simple formula in the business world. Sales minus costs equals gross profit. And when it comes to paint materials, how do we define the sales? Well, they're paint material dollars revenue that come to us in the collision repair business over a period of time. And usually those dollars are determined by our estimating systems, either automatically calculated by the typical and traditional material allowances multiplied by the paint labor hours, but also by manual entries. And these are often negotiated with insurance companies. Of course, our costs are what we pay for those materials, and typically that information comes to us through our suppliers, typically the distributor servicing our businesses, again, over that same period of time. And naturally, the gross profit is a difference of those two.
As we start to approach the issue of reducing these costs, we first need to understand what we're doing. We need to define the paint and material. First of all the products used to repair the body or finish the vehicle, we need to determine what we're going to include. We need to segregate perhaps body materials, seam sealers, perhaps we might segregate adhesive kits, we may segregate fasteners, sound deadening pads, mixing cups and cans, paint booth filters. Different businesses include different things in their definition. And to start out with, you might interact with your paint company, another vendor, to help establish a definition that you're going to use. You may even establish your own. But the most critical thing is that you have a definition so that you can use it consistently, so that you can measure trends. Of course, as we're talking about reducing costs, the obvious implication is that we want to see the costs going down, and that trend is the most critical measurement.
Absolutely, Darrell. And one of the things that comes to mind as we discuss this, it's really important, as if any business accounting, that we keep the sales and costs together. So if we're going to categorize something as a paint material or a part, if we really want to capture that gross profit accurately, the cost must accompany that sale.
Absolutely. You may want to keep in mind your insurance relationships as well. For example, some insurance companies, you may have a relationship with perfectly fine with paying for adhesive kits or certain sealers or other things that can be broken out separately. So you may want to consider them as a part. You may want to look at charging a separate amount for your fasteners, and perhaps you might have a system that allows you to print invoices for that, and therefore you wouldn't include invoices for the fasteners with your paint material account. Again, part of this can be dependent upon your insurance relationships and what they're comfortable with.
Absolutely. Krista, let's look at that next slide. And what we see here are just a whole host of metrics that are in place that a variety of MSOs and single location collision repair facilities use as metrics to track their paint material expenses and measure gross profit. Tom, in your role with MSOs, I'm sure you come across a range of these. Do you want to speak to any of those in particular?
Well, some of the benchmarks that we use are looking at materials as a percentage of sales. So we would look at the material sale, assign a benchmark of we would hope to achieve something around 10% material sales as a percentage of the overall sales. And then we can contrast that to the cost of materials. So if we were to achieve a benchmark of 50% cost of materials to total sales, we're looking at a very healthy 50% gross margin in materials. So those are some of the benchmarks that we keep an eye on. Great.
So we're really talking about a 5 to 6% expense to sales number. 5% would be outstanding. 6 we see as a common benchmark. Mm-hmm. And as Tom said, if we hit our benchmark of 10% sales to sales, that would leave us with a 40 to 50% gross profit, which is very commendable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now, it's a challenge to reach those metrics. That benchmark of 50% gross profit on materials it's a challenge, to say the least, to achieve that number. But with management and with a vision, with strategy and executing that strategy, it is achievable.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. Krista, you want to take us to that next slide with the sample report?
Sure. Well, before we do that, we have one more polling question for those members of our audience who are either an MSO or a single shop location. So the question is up on your screen. Do you utilize your paint supplier for performance data? Please answer yes or no. And again, just as a reminder, throughout the presentation, you can submit questions through the Q&A tab on your screen. We will be addressing these at the end of the presentation. So again, the question is, do you utilize your paint supplier for performance data? Answer yes or no. Okay, it looks like about 65% of our MSO or single location attendees do utilize their paint supplier for performance data. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a sample report.
Thank you, Krista. Well, that was a perfect timing in terms of that data. It's very interesting that essentially 2 out of 3 of the attendees utilize the paint company for that. This sample report is an actual report. I apologize, it might look a little fine print there, but it does indicate, if you look at the vertical columns, each represent a different shop. This is from an MSO, and the lines on the left side break down materials and paint materials into definitive categories. If you can see, the MG there represents liquid costs, the AP represents associated costs, and this is just a type of sample a report that you can get from a paint company that can help you analyze it. One of the beauties of this sort of thing is that in this case where we have 7 different shops being compared, it helps us to establish some benchmarks. Those greatest performing shops in any one of those areas can help you to understand what really a good number is versus a not so good number. And of course, as we just indicated, that those of you that work with your paint companies on that may have some insight on that as well.
That's really interesting, Darrell, and I would point out, too, that on that sample report, I think it's really great that they've broken out the liquid consumption, the clear toners and sealers or primers. And we would encourage to get a useful analysis that you can really take action on, and that's something that we're embarking on as we speak, that we take the allied products and we break those out in very specific categories as well, because we find out that just knowing what that allied number is in aggregate really doesn't tell us much. But when we find out what the abrasive consumption is with the masking consumption, with PPS, what the other categories within the total allied, that's what's most helpful to us in pinpointing what might be off, where we might need an SOP to address a situation.
Those are great points, Geoff. Speaking as an MSO repairer, I get lots of reports and data, and frankly, when I start to see something that's a little bit off, for example, my paint material gross profit might be off. This is the kind of tool that I'm going to look at to really drill down to identify specifically where the problem is. If I can get down to the point where maybe somebody's using too many toners, surface and sealer, whatever it is. Toners, for example, I might have a painter that's over-mixing. That allows me, by looking at these numbers, to drill down to identify that, to help coach the painter on how to minimize how much he mixes for a given job. This kind of data really allows us to drill down to some very specific areas that we didn't used to have in the industry.
Absolutely, and I don't know what your experience has been, Darrell, but I know in our case, when I've looked at the data for a number of different scenarios of different collision repair facilities, when a paint material number is off, and typically it gets our attention when it's too high on the left side, it very seldom is across the board in all those different areas. It's usually 1 or 2 areas that are way off, and then that is more helpful to you when you know that, where to look to see what you need to do to address it.
Exactly. Krista, let's go to the next slide.
So what we'll address now, Darrell, is the benchmarks. And every MSO and collision facility that we meet with and we get into these financial discussions, these benchmarks are extremely helpful, because I think everybody likes to see how do they stack up, how do they compare to some of the leaders in the industry, and particularly those businesses that are in similar situations. In other words, if I'm an MSO and my volume is in the $3 to $5 or greater $1 million per location situation, I want to compare myself to other similar operations. And likewise, a smaller single location, if you're in the $1 to $2 million range, you probably should be looking at how you stack up to other $1 to $2 million sales operations.
That's a great point, Geoff. I know from my own personal experience, I can remember the first 20 groups I went to. The business that I was affiliated with had a paint material gross profit of about 25%, and frankly, we thought that was a pretty good number. I go to this 20 group, and I realize some of my peers are doing much better. They're getting gross profit numbers in the 40s. Frankly, I had no idea. All of a sudden, this new benchmark is like the heavens opening up for me and light coming down, where it gives me the opportunity to start looking for ways that I can improve it. So I started talking to other members of the 20 group, getting advice in terms of what they did, got some advice from some vendors, went to work on it, and over a period of time, I was able to drive it up into the 40s as well.
Excellent.
I think it's important that we remember that benchmarks are just what you make of them. They can be a number that you get from the industry or that you get from colleagues or a number that you make up yourself, but it's a number that you're going to measure your own performance to so that it's a standard that you can measure your own performance to. So it's a goal, if you will, and the source of the benchmark isn't as important as what you hope your target and your goals are.
That's a great point, Tom, and just one more point in that area that I think is worth mentioning. Typically, when we talk about paint material profitability, and I am reminded of the change that you made in the subject slide, the very initial slide, Darrell, but there's two ways to do that. We can either reduce the costs or we can increase sales, or a combination of the two. And oftentimes that increasing sales piece is not really focused on, and yet that can have a phenomenal impact on the overall profitability of paint materials.
Exactly. That leads us into the next slide, Geoff, on sales.
So sales is simply defined, what we should point out first of all is that most of the numbers that we look at, most of the metrics that we analyze to are really defined and recorded as a percentage of sales. So obviously, if I'm looking at a simple fraction, if I increase the bottom number, which is the sales number, I will decrease the overall number if it's cost. So I can reduce my costs, again, by increasing sales or reducing the cost of that item. And these are really important for MSOs and really anybody in the collision repair business to really focus on that. It's not just a cost issue.
I think you really need to understand your estimating system to get those sales where they potentially can be. There's a lot of information out there, starting with the P pages in the estimating systems. A lot of good classes out there that will help you understand that. And of course, as the bottom mark indicates, you need to understand your geographic area in terms of what's the norm for what you can charge and what you can't. But frankly, the way our estimating systems are built, they only give you a certain amount of information up front when you enter in certain parts or panel replacements and repairs, and you need to really understand the estimating system. You need to know those things that are not included. And there's just a ton of things that come to mind. You can think in terms of corrosion protection, flex add, tint, adjacent panel well damage, feather prime and block, paint material caps, clear coat caps, the bumper prompt in terms of is one mixing for the paint operation or not, whether or not it's a separate finish operation, and there's a whole lot of others. I mean, there are lists of forgettables out there that are really handy to reference to so that we get what we have coming on the estimate based upon what you can get in your geographic area, the insurance relationships that you have, and therefore maximize your sales, because that just drives the profitability for the paint material category.
Absolutely, and therein might be part of the problem you just mentioned, Darrell. There's just a whole host of non-includeds, and I think what happens oftentimes is we just get buried in the multiple opportunities instead of really focusing on one or two and really making sure that those become habits for our estimators and repair planners. I'm reminded that having been in the sales side of things for most of my life, that I know one thing for certain: if I don't ask for the order, I'll never get it.
Exactly. I know we talked about benchmarks before. I know one that I often hear referred to in our 20 group meetings is the average number of paint hours per RO. That's another good measurement, as well as the percentage of the total repair sales, and a very good indicator if you're getting those not included or not.
Absolutely.
And I think the classic point of relationships with the customers and relationship selling is important too. If we communicate clearly with our insurance clients and we properly document, everybody wants to do what is right, and with the proper standard operating procedures and claims management, we can make that happen.
Thanks, Tom. Krista.
once we're able to gather all this data that you've been talking about, we're going to be able to see the good and bad performance in different areas. So how can our listeners proceed going forward to gain improvement?
Exactly. So we've done all this analysis. We've got pages of data. We've identified what the benchmarks are. So now what do we do with it? That's a big question. Really, I think we start looking for some of those worst performing areas. Potentially we could have some training issues there. I've seen examples where painters just feel it's an appropriate thing to do to perhaps overmix a little bit, have a little extra color left over. Better to be safe than sorry. Sometimes they can get a little carried away with that. You need to keep in mind when it comes to that topic that you know what your paint costs perhaps are. You can easily spend $100 or $200 perhaps for a gallon of clear, but I've often heard the expression that it costs $5,000 to fill a waste drum. So therefore that can be a big offender of waste. You start analyzing your technicians, look for specific technicians that might be causing a problem, or for an MSO specific shops. You might get your paint company to help assist you with that, or other vendors that can help you with some analysis, is taking kind of an independent perspective. And of course the big one are redos. A lot of shops measure the number of redos they do, and when you think about it, that's rather obvious. When you look at the cost per job, if all of a sudden you have to repaint the job, you've just doubled the cost of your paint material.
Absolutely, and it really is a major hit, as you mentioned, Darrell, because not only did we waste that material, but now we're occupying our technicians with non-revenue generating work because they're not going to get paid for that second time around.
Exactly.
It's important with the MSOs too, because there's so much variance between each store. From store to store, there can be wide variation in the performance of waste management. And I think it's important to look at the high-performing stores and the high-performing technicians and try to duplicate what their success is and bring that to the rest of the organization. So if we can find those stores or those technicians that are performing exceedingly well and then bring those to the identified stores and technicians that have the lesser performance, then we can raise the entire bar.
Absolutely. That's a critical point, Tom. Oftentimes we don't take the opportunity to celebrate the great performance, and then once we celebrate it, then try to replicate that in the other locations that we have responsibility for.
Exactly. I know we're going to be getting into some suggestions. I have seen some examples where companies can essentially incent technicians for higher performance. And sometimes the incentive doesn't have to be big. I've even seen situations where maybe it's a little paid vacation, or sometimes it's even the pride in succeeding when compared to their peers. In an MSO scenario, oftentimes paint technicians want to know how they're performing compared to the other shops. And there can form some healthy competitiveness that can really help them start paying attention to reducing costs.
Absolutely, Darrell. It's the same as you just mentioned in those 20 groups. It's the same phenomena. You get a bunch of top-notch performing repair facilities, and these owners take a lot of pride in their businesses, and you get that natural competition. They want to see how they stack up. Well, the painters, as technicians, are no different in that regard. They want to see how they stack up against their peers.
Exactly. We all have a natural inclination to want to win. Krista, I really like this slide. This is a simple guide to help analysis. This breaks it down into the most basic terms to help us understand where does the paint go. And think of it in this way. First, the paint can only leave your shop in one of three ways. Either on a car, and when you're thinking about that, think about how much material you're putting on the car, and when you think in terms of that, those redos, again, they just kill you if you're doubling the amount of material. Number two, in a waste container. Again, you think of how much it costs to fill that waste drum, if we're over-mixing toners especially. Also consider the use of cleaners, clears, base coats. I've seen examples where some shops will use the PPS cups, mark the time on there that they mixed it, understand what the shelf life is of the material, and maybe the next painter can use what's left over in there as long as it's within that given time period. And number three, by carrying it out. And as much as you hate to think about that, there are occasions where people do steal things. And so that paint material could potentially be leaving your shop in a box or in some other container that an individual is carrying it out. So really, it can only be leaving your business in one of those three ways. And so when you start researching where is the waste, I think it's really helpful to keep that in mind in terms of how you do your research.
Absolutely, and in that waste area, it's almost, again, another double hit because you're wasting material that's not going on the car. You paid for it. It's not going in the car. And then on top of it, you got to pay somebody else to get it out of your facility.
Yes, absolutely.
There are some in the industry who will claim that there is upwards of 30% in waste in materials, and that number is staggering. So any efforts to help manage that and be more efficient in the consumption of materials, the action of production in the shop is going to consume materials. But if we're measuring that performance, we can identify where those waste events are taking place and then start to put actions in place to manage that.
Absolutely. Paint companies can be a good resource to help coach painters in terms of how much toner they need to mix for a given panel. Like I said, it's awful easy to mix that little extra bit, and you start adding up those costs, and they go up quickly. Paint is exceedingly expensive. I don't know if any of you have bought any paint lately, but I know I sometimes look at our paint material invoices, and some of the costs are just staggering for each of these products. It's not uncommon to spend, $100, $200, $300 for a relatively modest-sized container of toner.
And to that point, you mentioned PPS a little earlier, Darrell, but I know that was a big learning for us, that we're all creatures of habit, and oftentimes the painter will mix a certain amount based on what his or her experience is and what's required for that job. And one of the things we learned with PPS is that we don't need to mix as much. And sometimes it was a matter of asking them what they would mix for that job and say, okay, you're going to have to trust me on this, but mix an ounce less or 2 ounces less. And now let's do that panel or that hood. And we're able to get that job done.
The automated systems are a lot of help too, aren't they? The ones that the paint companies often provide might be some expense to you there, but there are systems that will require that the painter put everything across a scale, and the system will measure it, weigh it, I should say, and log it into the shop's management system, so you can really identify specific costs for given shops.
That's a great way to track material consumption, and Tom, I'm sure you see a lot of that in the MSO world.
We do, and by tracking the consumption and comparing it to production, we can identify areas that are wasteful and areas that are efficient.
Great, thanks.
Here's a few suggestions in terms of what can we do. Now, we've already talked about some of these in terms of incentivizing paint technicians. Standardizing products is another good one, especially in an MSO environment. Maybe you guys can speak to that because
Sure.
You're so closely involved with that. You think in terms of an MSO with a significant amount of purchasing power, and plus making it that much more difficult to really stay on top of this topic in multiple shops. Tom, what do you think about that?
Well, when we measure the performance of materials, one of the things that comes in mind and can really have an impact on efficiency is having an approved product list. Because, Darrell, when you think about it, if you've got a store that has 5 technicians in it, how many different ways are there to fix a dent? They probably have 5 or maybe even 6 different ways, which includes all kinds of different products. Each technician has their favorites, and it can get out of hand quickly. But by having an approved product list, it really starts to efficiently manage those products consumed. Everybody's doing it the same way, and that just inherently starts to reduce the amount of waste. So by putting those standards into place, approved product list, coupled with standard operating procedures so that every technician is making every repair the same way, what happens just almost immediately is a more efficient management of the materials.
How about written repair procedures? I know we at LaMettry's Collision keep adding more and more SOPs to our business to formalize our precise operating procedures. Are you seeing more and more of that, Tom, in other MSOs?
Definitely. We see the success of that, and then what we do is we replicate it throughout their organization and even other organizations. So that standardization is one of the premier methods of effectively managing materials, and labor costs too.
And on top of that, I would surmise that in addition to managing those costs and controlling that waste, improvement of quality must go hand in hand with that as you standardize and get more standardization and SOPs in place.
If we instill a standard operating procedure that we know beforehand is going to produce a quality end product, then we can rely on that. If everybody does it the same way with the same approved products, then we can predict that every repair will come out the same way.
I think that predictability is just huge in our industry today because we're all seeking faster cycle times, and we know that the slower the cycle time, the worse the customer satisfaction, and so we're all focused on that and improving our process. And when we can have a predictable process, it's so much easier to make it faster.
Right, and what we do is we end up making the repair right the first time. which is going to help with improve cycle times as well. And if we do see a defect, then we can work backwards to find out where did this defect happen and what broke down in the standard operating procedure. Or does there need to be an improvement made to the standard operating procedure because of different manufacturing methods or different makes and models of cars that come through? Do we need to adjust for those occasions? So by studying where the defect happened and working backwards to find out what needs to be corrected, it enhances quality that way as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
And we have a few more suggestions here. Geoff?
This one I find very interesting. We'll let that one sink in a little bit. Geez, you didn't do that when you were in your role of running those operations, did you, Darrell?
Oh, no, I've never beat up a paint company.
I didn't think
exactly
so.
Right.
This is interesting. We encounter numerous situations across the country. The supplying jobber who's servicing those collision repair facilities, they really want to help their customer. They want to provide them quality product, and they want to help them be more competitive and be more profitable. At the same time, the collision repair facility has got their challenges, and they're trying to maximize profitability. And oftentimes that ends up in a little battle, a little tug of war between the supplying jobber and the repairer. And what we have found in case after case that it really doesn't make that much of an impact, and it's almost kind of puzzling because in most cases, the collision repairer is making more money on paint materials than the jobber supplying them. And the impact when they do get some kind of break is really minimal. But there are numerous things that we can do in partnership with our jobbers to help that collision repairer become more profitable.
I agree. And frankly, I think whether you're considering a jobber or a specific product, when we start measuring the cost of them, we should be thinking in terms of the value that they provide. Wouldn't you agree, Geoff?
Absolutely. If it was just the cost, at 3M, we wouldn't sell a whole lot because we're usually more expensive. But we do enjoy the business of a variety of customers, and we really cherish and appreciate that business. And we get up every day trying to see what can we do to bring value to our customer to help them become more profitable.
As we saw earlier, 2 out of 3 of our attendees rely on their paint company for information. So obviously that's a valuable part of their relationship with them. Perhaps there is an opportunity where they can buy their paint somewhere maybe a little bit cheaper, but they may not get those kind of services.
Absolutely. We see that all the time. And I know Tom has been involved in a number of scenarios with customers that speak volumes to that very point. Tom, did you want to make a comment in that area?
Well, it goes back to the very first slide that Darrell had where we start with a vision and move it into a strategy and then execute that strategy. And if your supplier, if your vendor, if the manufacturer can bring value in executing that vision, executing that strategy, then we can achieve that 50% profitability on materials. Now, we throw that 50% gross profit on materials kind of loosely, but really that's an entitlement figure. And what we mean by entitlement is that there are stores that are making that. And I like to say that they're making it when they're buying the good stuff from the good guys and able to achieve those gross margins. But it's not commonplace. But when we work together, when you work with your supplier and your manufacturers, and we all bring the resources that we have to efficiently manage the sales and the cost of materials, we can achieve that using the good stuff from the good guys.
I agree that example I gave earlier about learning about my paint material profit and through that 20 group learning how to improve it. That 20 group was partially sponsored by a paint company, and granted it was a very good paint company, and perhaps I would have been able to buy some paint somewhere a little bit cheaper. I did negotiate the best price I could with that paint company, but frankly that paint company offered a lot of value to me in my business.
Absolutely, and every one of us is the same way. We're all consumers at some point or another, whether we're the consumer in this scenario, the collision repair, or we're a consumer in our own lives, whatever we buy. We always want to get the most for our money. We want value. We don't want to overpay for anything. Nope. But we do want to get the most value, and that usually leads us to make a purchase decision that is not the least expensive option, but the best value option. And that burden is on us. That onus is on us to make sure that we are providing the best value.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I really love that quote. Progress is man's ability to complicate simplicity. One of our great leaders at 3M once made the comment to me, and I never forgot it. He said, Geoff, it's really, really easy to make things complex. The challenge is to keep it simple. And that really speaks volumes to the challenge and the issue and the topic that we're speaking to today. We really need to make sure that we don't overcomplicate things. There's numerous ways to measure this performance, and I think our best bet is to take it one step at a time, as the slide says, and pick those metrics that we really can get accurate data for, and then be very diligent about measuring it. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded about, and it's not a coincidence, I'm reminded about a weight management program I went on recently, and we spent a great deal of time. We went to sessions once a week, and the statistic that they gave us, which I found very compelling, is it was well over 75%. The 75% success rate that they had in people who took this class in losing weight was based on two measurements. That the people who lost the weight were diligent about measuring their calorie intake, and they were diligent about measuring their exercise and their calorie output, if you will. Mm-hmm. And when you measured those, then you had a tendency to track things, and you were on track, and you knew when you fell off the wagon, so to speak. If I had a pretty wild weekend, I knew that next week I had to get back onto the right mode and get those calories down. And it's the same way in our businesses. If we want to really improve paint material profitability, we have to measure it, we have to track it, and we have to keep monitoring it.
Exactly. It's awful easy to look at it and think, gosh, I've purchased hundreds of products. I've got numerous techs working on numerous jobs. How do I possibly get my arms around this? And frankly, like you said, it's take one step at a time and break it down. We've shown a lot of data here, and so when you start assembling this data, you've got to be a little selective and pick the low-hanging fruit to start out with. And again, you don't have to attack it all at once. You might pick an area that you're farthest off the benchmark, for example, one perhaps of more significance in terms of dollar value to your business, and then work on that one. And then try and make some changes, measure, make some more changes, measure till where you're satisfied with it, and then attack another topic.
Absolutely, and we're involved in that right now with a number of customers on the sales side, where we're encouraging our customers to improve their sales, to increase their sales by getting some of those non-includeds. And quite frankly, as you mentioned earlier, you had that whole list. I mean, there are literally hundreds of repair operations. But we can't deal with hundreds. If we pick two, if we pick one, work on it, measure it, monitor it over time, and see the improvement, it's very, very powerful.
Exactly.
And what's fun in the MSO world regarding that is if you make one small change, a marginal improvement, it might have thousands of dollars of impact on a store or $10,000s of dollars. And when we multiply that over the entire organization of an MSO, all of a sudden those tens of thousands of dollars become hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. Mm-hmm. So the small incremental marginal changes in the management of materials can have profound differences on gross profits in the business.
And sometimes changes within our industry can be a longer-term evolution. For those of us that have been in the industry for a long time, perhaps you remember, we didn't used to get paid to blend panels. We were often told that's up to us to make it match. And over a period of time, there's more discussion, some assistance from paint companies. You learn about what's included, what's not included in the estimating system. Shops started talking about it more, working with insurance companies. And now in most cases, it's kind of the norm that we get paid to blend when it's appropriate. So again, these things can change. It may take a period of time, may take some persistence, but it can change.
Absolutely. In fact, they will change. And one of my favorite exercises is to sit down with an owner and a repair planner and look at a recent closed RO, look at the final estimate, and you go to that last list of add-ons, and you find out, and I'll ask the question, well, geez, how long have you been getting paid for that? Oh, for a while. Well, were you getting paid for that 20 years ago? Well, no, not 20. Well, 15? No. 10? No. Well, yeah, maybe 10. Okay. Well, what happened between 10 and 15 years ago? When you weren't getting paid, now you're getting paid.
Right.
Well, somebody started asking for it.
Right.
They did their homework, they documented it, they started asking for it, and lo and behold, we're seeing sales in that area.
Exactly.
One thing we know for sure is repairs are going to get more complicated, not simpler. And with proper communication, proper documentation, and education, this will evolve to where we do the right thing.
And we'll get paid for doing it.
Great point. Thank you.
Okay, Krista, I think that brings us to the questions.
Okay, well, Geoff, Darrell, and Tom, thank you so much for your insights. Now we'd like to take this opportunity to solicit some questions from our viewers. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab on your screen to type them in and send them our way. So first we're going to start off with the 50% gross product number. Is that based on sprayables only?
No, that would have other associated materials with it also. Again, definitions can vary from one business to another, perhaps one paint company or insurance company to another. But what we've seen a lot of examples, I should say, we've seen some examples of the higher performing shops that are able to achieve that kind of number. That's not something that I would say would be the norm. What do you think, Tom? Wouldn't that be the higher level performing shops?
Without a doubt. I mean, once again, that's entitlement. And by entitlement, we mean that there are shops that achieve it. It's not the most common metric that we see. But with diligence in maximizing the revenue mix, with diligence in managing cost, and with the appropriate and the proper accounting techniques, we can achieve 50% on all paint and allied materials.
And traditionally, that paint material profitability is all paint materials. But that raises an interesting point. I mean, typically, if we're going to look at the cost side of the equation of that, oftentimes most shops really look at, well, what's my bill from my paint shop or from my supplier? Well, we need to look at those bills because there's going to be items in there that aren't paint materials. I'm reminded of maybe they buy some tools from that jobber. One particular invoice might have a lot of DAs or something. Well, that doesn't belong in paint materials, and we have to take that out. But certainly those paint material profitability numbers are all allied and liquid is number one. And I would say the number that I see more often than not is between the 30 and 40% range. I would categorize
that would be
that
an
as
industry average.
Very common and good solid performance between that 30 and 40% range.
And as an industry, don't we vary a lot on the other end of the spectrum? Don't some shops struggle to show a profit at all in paint material?
When we look at the metrics in collision repair and we talk about the revenue streams and the profitability, if you look at the labor mix, the parts mix, paint material sublet, the other three tend to have a fairly tight band around what the benchmarks or the norms are. But boy, paint materials has a huge spread. I've seen everything from 0 and some losing money all the way up to 50 and 60%. I mean, it's just phenomenal, the range.
Can you give us a guideline for a partial panel refinish costs?
You may want to interact with your estimating company on that. Don't quote me on this, but if I'm not mistaken, at least some of the estimating systems apply, I want to say 16 or 19% of the refinish time to the actual spraying of the panel. And when you think about a partial panel refinish, in most cases you're going to find that most of the preparation in terms of sanding, masking, that sort of thing, is the same whether you're doing a partial or a complete panel refinish. So the difference in the partial panel is the amount of time it takes to spray a portion of it versus spraying the entire panel. So if you think in terms of that portion that is allocated toward the actual spraying and adjust that accordingly, then I think that will get you to the answer that you're looking for. You're probably only talking about 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 tenths, something like that, depending upon the panel.
Thanks, Darrell.
Next question. How do you overcome deals with insurance DRPs to bring work into your shop when your time and material is cut? And the example offered was a partial paint within panel for less than what you would get for blending an undamaged panel.
Boy, this gets into some politics within our industry and is not an easy one to answer. There are companies out there that make business decisions that they may accommodate certain pricing structures with a given insurance company. So how do we as other repairers overcome that? I don't know that there's a good answer for that. Any given business out there can set their own pricing and make an arrangement with someone, and I don't know that there's anything that we can do about it. Other than I think my suggestion would be pay attention to what's fair and reasonable in the market. Use your estimating system as a guideline in terms of what is appropriate to have on an estimate for a given operation and what's not, and then do your best in negotiating with the insurance companies, and then after that make a decision on what will work for your individual business.
That's a great point, Darrell, and I'm reminded oftentimes in the industry, collision repairers will comment on how many consumers really don't know what their insurance policy says, right?
Yes.
And usually you don't take a good hard look at it until you get in an accident. Well, conversely, I'd say it's very important that collision repairers take a good hard look at that DRP agreement before they sign it. Oftentimes there's things in there that are negotiable. Once you sign it, it's going to be pretty tough to overcome that unless and until that DRP agreement runs its course, and then maybe you renegotiate. But while you're in that process, you need to take really good care of and pay close attention to what's in the agreement, what's being asked of you, and what is within your ability to concede or to agree to.
Exactly.
And the better we know our estimating systems and the better we know our local market area, the better position we'll be in to negotiate a fair deal for ourselves.
Yes, and research. I've seen examples where insurance companies may have certain requirements in their DRP contracts that perhaps they don't enforce. They may intend to someday. So you need to have a good understanding of that. You also need to perhaps have a good understanding of what the individual field appraiser's expectations are, because frankly, that can even change. When they change a particular inspector, maybe they have a little different interpretation of the company's guidelines, and you may have to behave a little differently as a result.
Thanks, Darrell.
I'm staying on the topic of the insurers for a minute. Why do insurers not consider the color code when estimating paint costs?
That's another interesting topic. As an industry, we have looked at different ways of charging for paint material. And the most common one in the estimating systems looks at a given labor rate for every paint hour. And then obviously that is not a precise one because it doesn't take color into consideration. There have been some estimating companies that have developed products that do take some specific products into consideration, and it drills it down and makes it much more complicated. The pros and cons are that those systems that offer more specific measurements certainly are more precise, without doubt. But then it also, there are those that fear that some insurers may look at that as an opportunity to shop different paint lines, and it also can potentially create a little bit more in terms of friction points. The one advantage with the kind of vague system that I shouldn't say vague, it's more universal generic system that we typically use is that there's usually not a lot of discussion on it unless you are dealing with a paint cap. Usually it's just kind of lumped into that, and the understanding is that the shop at the end of the month hopefully comes up with a decent gross profit and lives with it, and it works. So again, just to summarize, there are advantages with the more precise systems in terms of being specifically accurate, but they do come with some more complications as well.
And that raises the whole point about, documentation. I think that gets into, if we utilize those systems that the paint companies provide in terms of mixing on the scale and tracking the material consumption, that will factor in if it's a very expensive pigmented color that they might need more. And if they have that documentation, I wouldn't say that they'll always get paid, but that documentation would certainly lend itself to them asking for an increase because that particular paint is just that much more expensive.
Exactly, and that tool comes in so handy if you're dealing with an insurer that might have a paint cap or a paint threshold that may say above this certain X number of dollars we want to discuss it, and we want to see some documentation really showing what you perhaps paid for that.
I saw an example just recently. This particular repair was done on the Mitchell system, and they used the refinished materials calculator. And the shop was complaining that the insurer had capped their paint materials, and certainly they did. But what was interesting is at the bottom end of that closed estimate was a line entry called the RMC differential. And so what it was is they put on there and billed the insurance company for the difference between what the RMC said they should have been paid, what they allowed, and so they got paid for it, and interesting enough, that went into parts.
Interesting. Next question, Krista.
Do you see material calculators becoming more popular in the future?
Frankly, I don't know. They seem to be gaining in some popularity for a while, and again, like I said, it can sometimes cause some additional friction points, and so the kind of the vague generic system that we use has some popularity for that reason. What do you think, Geoff? Tom?
Standardization is important. So until the time that we can get some standardization and accurate predictability around that, it's going to be difficult.
Where I would say, I don't know if I would call it a material calculator, what we are seeing gaining popularity is, invoicing tools for capturing materials consumed in a non-included operation. And we're seeing that more and more, and quite frankly, that's the way it ought to be. And what we're capturing, and when I've had discussions with insurance companies, we'll talk about plastic repair as an example, they get real nervous and they don't particularly care for these kits. A shop will charge the insurance a kit for plastic repair, and it's a standard number of $30 or whatever it is. Well, the fact of the matter is the materials consumed on any given job are going to depend on the extent of the damage on that job. So when we attach an invoice where we document exactly what we used on a particular job, and maybe the materials on one job might be only $15, but on another one it might be $45. We find that the insurance companies prefer that approach because it's specific to that job, and there's the documentation of what was consumed, what was used on the job.
Good.
Any other questions, Krista?
Yes. Do you know an average cost per hour for materials charged nationwide?
I don't know that we have that. That could even vary.
Region by region, the variance is so great that even to calculate an average wouldn't be indicative of there's means and modes and medians and how we would understand that. To assign an average to that, I'm not sure that it would even be productive.
There are different estimating practices in different parts of the country, and part of that's as a result of significantly different labor rates. And so therefore, let's just say a typical $2,000 hit in San Francisco might not have the same hours on the job that a $2,000 hit in Detroit might have. Mm-hmm. And so for that reason, it becomes pretty difficult to measure the cost per hour.
And to Tom's point, and it might not be all that helpful to know what that is because it's going to be such a variance depending on the part of the country and
exactly
the situation that you're in.
What is helpful is to measure our own performance and then maybe compare that to the region or the locale or the certain part of the country to compare how you're performing to colleagues in your own market.
Yes.
Great point. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, this will probably be our last question today. Any comments on the lean thinking philosophy that's applied to the body shop?
Well, that's quite a topic. Lean is pretty extensive, and it really touches all aspects of the collision repair business, from claims management to accounting principles to production efficiencies in the shop. One thing we know that in order to win, and in order to win in this business, we're going to need efficiencies. And the lean methodology is really a manufacturing-based type of methodology, and it pertains very well to what we do in the collision repair business. So in order to be a low-cost provider, in order to maximize profits and still be a low-cost provider, lean methodology is going to have to be implemented to some degree in order to survive in the future. So those types of practices, how in-depth you want to get, we can be as shallow as implementing 5S methods, or we could go as deep as really getting into the whole DMAIC process where we measure and control every operation within the collision repair business. But I think to answer the question, lean methodology is absolutely critical if we want to be efficient in operating a profitable business.
I think there are some operations out there putting an immense amount of work into it. Wouldn't you agree? I know of some that are really focusing on theory of constraints and process and thinking in different terms than we used to. For example, oftentimes we'd look at a job, we're going to make a decision on one part versus another. We often would look at the cost difference and the bottom line difference. Well, more and more today, I think we're looking at what's the difference in completion times, and can we get another job out instead when we measure the performance of our company.
Without a doubt.
As they say, the devil's in the details, and lean is a profound concept, but one which is very challenging to implement.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to, in order to do it, you're going to need the resources from the industry, whether that's your supplier, manufacturers, associations, all of the above to help make that happen.
Well, thank you so much for all your input. That's all the time we have for questions today. Again, we'd like to offer a very special thank you to our event sponsors, UniCure and PPG, for their support in putting on this webinar. And thank you to those of you who joined us in this webcast. If you'd like to view the webcast again or share it with someone who is unable to participate, it will soon be archived at abrn.com/MSO paint costs. Again, that URL is abrn.com/MSO paint costs. So thank you again to our speakers, Darrell, Tom, and Geoff. I think you had some great insights that I hope will be a big help to our attendees today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Krista.
Thanks,
Happy to do
Krista.
it.
So thank you all and have a good day.